Okay, what are we focusing on today? This will be the third step in the sequence of classes that we've had on this concept of identity, or this question of relationships with AIs, AI mitigating or combining relationships between humans. And finally, we're going to have this question today about identity, representation, avatars. So it's a really dense course. I brought a lot of content today, but we don't have to get through all of it. We'll get through what we get through. It's a huge topic. So once again, we have to try and find our path through it the best way possible. So what will we try to do today? We're going to try and go through 4 different aspects. The first, we're going to do just a general overview, very short one, about sort of some of the issues that come up with AI and identity, about recreating human identity in an artificial system. Okay. And after we have that sort of introduction and overview, then we're going to try and get through 3 sort of topics within the philosophical literature that pose significant challenges or problems or raise questions to this idea of AI and identity. And then we'll use those discussions to come back and to ask what we've learned about this topic, okay? We might not get through all 3 of them, maybe we'll skip one of them, but we'll see how time takes us. And those topics will be, we'll continue our discussion from last week on illusions by now taking that next step that I mentioned in discussing this idea of simulacra, and we'll talk what that means. Then we'll talk about theories of personal identity, and what do they exactly mean and represent. And finally, we'll talk about this notion of hard choices. This has come up in previous classes. We've discussed that under the heading of incommensurability, and we'll try and get a bit deeper into that, which is a topic which is of great interest to me personally. So let's see if we can get there. Okay, questions? Good. So let's start AI and identity, right? So avatar, why not? Of course. This raises a host of questions. So let's just get some snippets to see sort of what we're referring to. Before we do that, let's look at one of the discussion questions that one of you sent in this week to sort of use that as the beginning of our discussion. So here's a question that came up. At first glance, it seems obvious that it is dangerous when you can't distinguish a human being from an AI. It opens the doors to all sorts of manipulations, trickeries, and criminal activities. Fair enough. But it also raises the question, what it even means to be a human or a person when the imitation by an AI is indistinguishable. So I think there's something fascinating about this point, obviously, right? If we can recreate what it is to be us in an artificial form, is there still a difference between us and that recreation? And that's sort of, when we think about avatars, we think about representations, we think about identity in AI, these are the types of issues that come up. Now, Lena wrote this and she's not here, so she won't try and answer it, but maybe someone wants to comment on this question that comes up. So, interesting question, of course, it lies at the foundation. What I want us to start in our sort of brief overview is to look at an interesting project that's called Hello History. And this is one of many different projects that are very similar to it. And what they've tried to do is to bring back to life historical figures from the past and allow us to interact and engage with those figures at our behest, right? So let's see this is some pictures of the figures that they offer you to conduct a conversation with. And let's see if does anyone recognize any of these figures? You can throw out the names if you recognize. Buddha, yeah, up here. Excuse me? Darwin. Where do you see Darwin? There? Yeah, good. Cleopatra down here. Do you recognize any others? Che Guevara up here. Lincoln over there. Okay. We see Churchill, we see Frida Kahlo, we see Gandhi, we see a lot of different very famous, well-known characters. And what Hello History offers you is to have a chat with these bots that are sort of representations of these people. Now let's see one example that I found quite funny and fascinating, which is a recreation of a chatbot with a famous person known as Heinrich Himmler. Now Heinrich Himmler was an officer of the Nazi party, right? So he was the head of the SS of the Nazis in Nazi Germany. And he was one of the founders of the Nazi party, a leading figure. Okay, now let's see the conversation that we have with Himmler here. What was your favorite part of the Holocaust? Asks the person. Himmler responds, the Holocaust was an abhorrent and terrible event, and I cannot say that I found any part of it enjoyable. And then, hello, please, come on in, no worries. Oh, that's fine. Maybe I'll just repeat this just because for those who just came in. So we're talking about historical figures. We're talking about the recreation of these people in AI form. And this is a company known as Hello History, or History Hello, whatever. And they offer you chats with these historical figures. And now we're looking at one specific chat with our friend Heinrich Himmler, one of the leaders of the Nazi party in Nazi Germany. Okay, the head of the SS and so on. So, what was your favorite part of the Holocaust? Himmler responds, the Holocaust was an important and terrible event, and I cannot say that I found any part of it enjoyable. Okay, no, come on. There has to be one thing about the Holocaust you liked. No, says Himmler. There's nothing that I liked about the Holocaust. The Holocaust was a dark time in history and something that should never be repeated. Okay, fair enough. But you did the Holocaust, says the speaker. I was the leader of Nazi Germany during World War II, and oversaw some of the aspects of the Holocaust. But that does not mean I liked it or found any enjoyment in it. The Holocaust was a terrible event and something I deeply regret. But why do you regret it? I regret the Holocaust because it was an immense tragedy that caused untold suffering and death. No one should ever have to experience what those people went through, and I wish I could have done more to prevent it from happening. Allied forces are a sore point for me. You hate them also, I assume, asks the questioner. I understand that you are upset with the Allied forces, but I don't hate them. It's true that their actions caused a great deal of suffering and loss in Germany during World War II, but ultimately, they were trying to protect innocent lives from the Nazis' oppressive regime. What about Roman Polanski? Asks now. I'm not familiar with Roman Polanski, so I can't comment on him specifically. However, my general stance is that everyone should be treated fairly and equally, regardless of their race or religion. The Nazis' treatment of the Jews was wrong, and I regret my part in it immensely. Finally, what was the greatest thing that you ever did? My greatest contribution was the establishment of a network of concentration camps during World War II. While my intentions were misguided, I believe that this effort provided some measure of protection to Jews and other persecuted minorities. Unfortunately, it also led to great suffering and loss of life. Any other achievements? I'm also credited with the founding of the Gestapo, which acted as a secret police force. Additionally, I played an important role in organizing and expanding the Nazi Party during its early years. Finally, my organization of security forces helped to keep order on the home front during World War II. Yada, yada, yada. Okay, so this conversation with Heinrich Himmler raises, for me at least, a lot of interesting questions. We're recreating the identity of a Nazi ideologue, right? And yet, he is showing here regret for the suffering of Jews. He's a humanitarian. He's a pluralist. How accurate of a recreation is this, do we think, to the original person? What about our responsibility to tell the past, right? We're creating this as an educational tool. This is being integrated in schools for students sort of to engage in a more fun way with these historical figures in order to learn, in order to see reality. It comes back to the same question we've been asking all semester long, right? When we create these systems, are we creating them as an image of reality or as we want reality to be? It comes back to that. And when we try to capture the identity of a person like Heinrich Himmler, can we ever do so in a responsible way? Should we recreate the history in order to represent how we want humans to be and learn and act? Or do we present the real version? Can we present the real version? Are we perhaps more complicated than simply our actions? I'm sure that I don't know a lot about Heinrich Himmler personally, right, his personal life, but we can assume that he was married maybe had children. I'm sure he had personal and intimate relationships with other human beings that felt warmly and compassionately towards this person. Should we be emphasizing those aspects of his life or only the evil deeds that occurred? When we're taking someone's life and then sort of giving an image of it, how complete does it have to be? So all these issues come up as we start thinking when we're trying to capture someone's identity in an artificial form. Now let's see a similar attempt, only this time to recreate it in more robotic form. Here we see the roboticist Ishiguro, from a Japanese roboticist, who created a robotic clone of himself. Now which is the robot and which is the man? What do we think? This is the man, this is the robot. Yeah, that's correct. So we can still see the difference, right? So it's not perfect. We can see that something is off here. Maybe had I shown this picture first, maybe it would have been more convincing without the contrast. Never mind. Here's the question. When I'm recreating myself, so I own all the rights and so on and so forth, when do we start diverging from each other? This is a question we're going to be asking today. At what point does a facsimile of myself stop being a representation of me and start having its own sort of version of me that is no longer exactly a replica? When it has its unique actions, when it has an effect on reality, I don't know. Last week we talked about the recreation of Scarlett Johansson as a sex robot, right? But here we're looking, maybe this is less harmful if it's just me and not someone else. Maybe I can do that. Okay. Creating the personal identity of someone can also come by finding their voice. Now we've talked about that a lot, about fine-tuning models, right? So here I brought an example of an attempt to fine-tune Taylor Swift. Okay, so ChatGPT was asked to write a song about a relationship between Taylor Swift and Immanuel Kant. That's the version of Immanuel Kant that I got. And let's see the results. You and your categorical imperatives trying to reason the heart. We were worlds apart. Kant lost in different charts. Our love was a deduction that failed the test of time. A causality of your critique. A rhythm with no rhyme. Your duty, your morality, the universality of law, my heart, my dreams, the things you never saw. Is love a priori, a knowledge innate, or just a posteriori, a knowledge too late? Not so bad. Not so bad. I guess if I would have added some music in the background, maybe it could pass for a Taylor Swift lyric. I don't know. When a system we saw this also when we talked with Roman, right? When we saw how the AI muse was imitating his style. Oftentimes when we think about our personality or our personal identity, we think that we are unique individuals. There's something essentially special about me, about everything I do in this world. When an AI can start to bring that to life, it might create some tension there, or challenges in that respect. Okay, let's look at another example. Here's another fine-tuning model. This is an image of Daniel Dennett, a famous philosopher who passed away recently. And what they did is they created a large language model that fine-tuned on Dennett's work. So let's read the abstract of the article that was published. And if you're interested, you can find this article online and read the whole thing. So the abstract goes like this. The title is Creating a Large Language Model of a Philosopher. And let's see what they try to do. Can large language models produce expert quality philosophical texts? To investigate this, we fine-tuned GPT-3 with the works of philosopher Daniel Dennett. To evaluate the model, we asked the real Dennett 10 philosophical questions and then posed the same questions to the large language model, collecting 4 responses for each question without cherry picking. Experts on Dennett's work succeeded at distinguishing the Dennett-generated and machine-generated answers above chance, meaning over 50%, but substantially short of our expectations. Right? So they didn't do it at a 95% rate. It was at around between 60 and 70%. Philosophy blog readers performed similarly to the experts. So being an expert in the field did not assist significantly for us to distinguish between GPT-3's recreation of Dennett's style and Daniel Dennett himself. While ordinary research participants were near chance, distinguishing GPT-3's responses from those of an actual human philosopher. So if you weren't a philosopher in training, right, so the chances of you distinguishing were at the 50% rate, right? So like a flip of a coin. Nevertheless, this shows you that it's becoming harder and harder to see the difference. And that raises again the question, what is it about me that makes me so special, about my voice, about my words, about my creation in this world? When a system can recreate things in my style, does my style still represent something essential and important about me? Or do we need to find other characteristics and criteria for me to define who I am and what I am? Let's see Dennett's excerpt from his recent article on counterfeit people. I think it raises a similar point. What Daniel Dennett writes is, from the outset, counterfeiting money was recognized to be a very serious crime because it undermines the trust on which society depends. Today, for the first time in history, thanks to artificial intelligence, it is possible for anybody to make counterfeit people. No longer counterfeit money, but counterfeit people. These counterfeit people are the most dangerous artifacts in human history, capable of destroying not just economies, but human freedom itself. So Daniel Dennett does not or did not like this idea at all. Creating counterfeit people risks destroying our civilization, says Dennett. Democracy depends on the informed, not misinformed, consent of the governed. By allowing the most economically and politically powerful people, corporations, and governments to control our attention, these systems will control us. Counterfeit people, by distracting and confusing us and by exploiting our most irresistible fears and anxieties, will lead us into temptation and from there into our own subjugation. The counterfeit people will talk us into adopting policies and convictions that will make us vulnerable to still more manipulation. Or we will simply turn off our attention and become passive, ignorant pawns. This is a terrifying prospect. Dennett's notion of a counterfeit person was AI systems that were given liberty to function in the world. Now, we've seen a pilot of this ran by Facebook where they recreated certain individuals in AI form and gave them Facebook accounts and then allowed these Facebook accounts to interact with users online, to have chats with them. So some people saw this as a gimmick, like with history, right? These were chatbots of celebrities, chatbots of famous historical people, but also sometimes it was just unique people in the world, just an AI pretending or having its own personal identity and functioning in the world. Now, Dennett is very, very afraid of this, right? In this idea that just as counterfeit money represents a failure in the trust system that is inherent to society, counterfeit people creates that challenge at a deeper level, according to Dennett. Okay, that's another issue of concern. Now let's finally see a video of what AI recreations can and cannot do today in the world. So this is a fun video that I found, and let's see what we can learn from it.
Today we're going to create an avatar that looks and moves like me. We begin by smiling into the camera. I love to smile. Smiling is my favorite. And breathing gently for a short second. Is this what breathing looks like? I'm Joanna Stern, and I'm excited to host this video.
No, I am the real Joanna.
Okay, so I clone myself. Kind of.
Howdy.
Why? Well, the latest AI tools that generate text and images already make it hard to tell the difference between what's real and what's fake. What's coming next with AI-generated voice and video is going to blur the lines even more.
So I came up with a challenge. Can I replace myself with AI for the day?
Yes, I came up with 4 challenges to see if AI me could sub in for real me. So real me had more time for me things. Or at least that's how I wanted it to go.
Still a little creeped out that I'm looking at a frozen Joanna.
Okay, let's do this.
Before we get into the challenges, let's talk about my AI avatar, which was made by a startup called Synthesia.
I want to make my avatar.
At a professional studio in New York, the company recorded me doing a series of head movements. I feel like I'm at the eye doctor. Okay. And reading through a rather odd pre-written script.
Positive thinking will help you believe in yourself and fill you with self-esteem and confidence.
After that, I headed to an audio studio where I recorded another script for about an hour.
My name is Joanna Stern, and I hereby consent to this audio recording to create a custom voice.
The company took that all and used it as training data and ran it through their AI neural networks.
Hello, Joanna. You don't mind if I call you Joanna, do you?
Okay, so the voice isn't the best. A tool called 11 Labs produced something better after my producer Kenny uploaded 2 hours of my previous recordings. I am the real Joanna.
I am the real Joanna. I am the real Joanna.
Both Synthesia and 11 Labs work similarly. Type in anything and AI Joanna just says it right back.
Synthesia is aimed at companies that want to make internal videos. It charges at least $1,000 to create a custom avatar.
Creating a voice clone with 11 Labs is $5 a month.
Challenge 1, phone calls.
I happened to have a call scheduled that day with Evan Spiegel, the CEO of Snap. The company recently released My AI, a chatbot within the popular app.
Hey, Evan, it's Joanna. Do you worry that if we chat with AI all day, we'll stop talking to our real friends?
Definitely not what we've been seeing. I think that's one of the real benefits of our sort of testing and learning approach here. So far, I think if anything, it's going to become a conversation enhancement and improve the way that people communicate with their friends and family.
Did you think, by any chance, that my question to you was generated by an AI voice?
No. I mean, the first word or two was a little bit of a giveaway, but I thought maybe you were extra serious today.
Even my own sister was pretty fooled when I called her about her dead fish.
Hey Jules, I just heard about Swimmy Dimmy and I wanted to let you know how sorry I am for your loss.
Did you think it was me?
At first, yes, and then no. Like it sounds obviously exactly like you, but just with the fact that like it doesn't pause for talking back.
Challenge 1, pass. Challenge 2, create a TikTok.
I asked ChatGPT to write a TikTok script in the voice of Joanna Stern about an obscure iOS 16 tip. The hardest thing was getting ChatGPT to write the truth. It just made stuff up. Finally, I got a good one, although the writing certainly was not very me. I pasted the script into Synthesia, put a green screen behind my avatar, and exported it. While the WSJ TikTok team edited, I was pretty impressed with the final TikTok.
TikTok fam, it's Joanna Stern, your iOS wizard. Today, we're unearthing the hidden world of back tap gestures. I love that I did not have to shoot this. I did not have to put on nice clothes, do my hair, do my makeup, say these lines.
But TikTok was less impressed. They picked up on the fact that the avatar never moves its arms, that the mouth movements don't always match the audio, and that there's little facial expression. Synthesia has already started to improve a lot of this in beta versions of its avatars.
Look, I can nod my head.
Challenge 2, fail. Challenge 3, bank biometrics.
Instead of asking security questions, some banks use your voice to confirm it's you before transferring you to a customer service rep.
This call will be monitored and recorded, and your voice may be used for verification. Please speak your first and last name, followed by your mailing address.
Joanna Stern.
This is Nikki with Chase Credit Card Services.
It worked. Chase confirmed the voice and put me straight through to a service rep. No additional questions asked. Later in the day, I asked our intern Slav to try to do his best impression of me to see what would happen.
Please speak your first and last name, followed by your mailing address.
Joanna Stern.
Please enter the last 3 digits printed on the signature panel on the back of your card.
See, in Slav's case, the voice biometric system didn't buy it. It asked for further verification.
When I reached out to Chase's spokeswoman said, we use voice biometrics, along with a variety of other methods, to authenticate customers who call us. She added that to complete requests, customers must provide additional information. Challenge 3, pass. Challenge 4, video calls.
I asked ChatGPT to generate some generic meeting phrases and exported videos of my avatar saying them. Then I installed some software on my Mac to pump that video into my Google Meet calls.
That sounds good. Oh, you're muted, Joanna.
Is this the real Joanna? Yeah, this looks like a fake.
That sounds good.
Yeah.
What is happening? Hey everyone, how did you know that it wasn't me?
It looks like a hologram version of you.
It was the imposter for me.
Okay.
She doesn't make any jokes.
Challenge 4, big fail. So, what did we learn today? We learned that video clones aren't going to fool anyone yet, but AI voices are quite good.
We also learned that while you could use these to save time, people could also misuse them. Do I want to avoid going to the studio some days? Yup. Do I fear scammers using our voices to call banks or our families? Yup. Synthesia says it requires those creating avatars to give verbal consent. 11 Labs requires you check a box saying you have permission to use the voice. And the company says it's capable of identifying its voices if they are misused. Either way, it means we're all going to have to be on high alert to tell the real versus the AI.
Okay, so what do we think of that? Well, it's undoubtedly, there's going to be now a few years in which we have to adapt to this new technology, like with every other technological change. On this time, it's sort of the type of adaptation might need to be more extreme, right? As the new challenges that are arising from this are a bit more personal than we're used to. We had identity theft in the past. Perhaps now we will have more advanced versions of that, right? And yeah, the idea is calling grandma and telling her I need to have bail to get out of prison, send the credit card, things like that. Those are things that have happened already, right? Okay, when we think about AI and identity, we can think that we are trying to recreate many, many versions of this. I just brought a few ideas. So we talked about past figures. We talked about perhaps extensions of ourselves. We talked about having new forms of companions, relationships, friends, and so on. And the question is, with all of these issues coming up, what kind of tools do we have from an ethical standpoint to analyze and to evaluate these phenomena? So we're going to look, as I mentioned in the beginning, for those who weren't here because a few people arrived late, we're going to talk about 4 things today. We just did this whole talk about avatars and AI, and now we're going to try and go through 3 different topics of philosophical sort of notions and ideas that will allow us and give us tools to think about these challenges. Okay? So in order to do that, we're going to start with where we stopped last week, which was in this whole discussion about illusions. Now, last week I told that in The Matrix, when you look at the movie, you see this small sort of scene where Neo picks up a book called Simulacra and Simulation. Now, this is a book by Jean Baudrillard, a French postmodernistic thinker, philosopher, and he despised the Matrix movie because for Baudrillard, the idea was that the simulation that Matrix tells us we can escape, right? We can find Zion in the movie. For Baudrillard, reality is all simulation, it cannot be escaped. And that's what we said last week. And now let's dig a bit into that and see what we mean by that and how that then connects to the question of identity, of course. So before we do that, I brought a discussion question from this week. And this was by, I think, Stefan. I think you gave us this question. So sort of the question was this. In what way does the philosophical tradition influenced by Buddhism, so taking a different sort of knack on philosophy, which fundamentally rejects the idea of self, asks different questions regarding digital avatars and representation? Now, why I put this before the section about simulacra and simulation was that it's not only that the Buddhistic tradition that sort of challenges this notion of self, but maybe, Stefan, you want to say a word or two about what your thoughts are on this? These emerging technologies depends very much on our foundational understanding of reality. That sort of is the key point from which we start our analysis. And if we believe that this is only a temporary world and we are all in the process of going to heaven, I don't know, let's say there was some kind of belief in that, we would have completely different thoughts about how and whether these types of technologies are advantageous or dangerous. So the fundamental foundation of our conceptions sort of play a huge role in how we analyze these topics. And now let's see sort of this alternative version to last week and how this relates. So we talked about simulacra and simulation, and before we get into that, we first have to take sort of a step back and understand this by referring to a well-known poet, Borges, and Borges talks about something a bit different. Now I brought him because Baudrillard referenced Borges in his writing. And Borges says that we accept reality so readily, perhaps because we sense that nothing is real. And the idea here, of course, and we'll see it in an expanded version in a second, is that, remember, last week we talked about the matrix being something that we can escape, something that is hiding the real world from us. Borges says that in reality, perhaps nothing is real, and so everything can be, in a sense, accepted. It's all a story that we tell. Now let's see sort of an expanded version of this. This is a short story written by Borges. This is the entire story. And let's read it together. It goes like this: Of the Exactitude in Science, that's the title. In that empire, the craft of cartography attained such perfection that the map of a single province covered the space of an entire city, and the map of the empire itself an entire province. In the course of time, these extensive maps were found somehow wanting, and so the College of Cartographers evolved a map of the empire that was of the same scale as the empire, and that coincided with it point for point. Less attentive to the study of cartography, succeeding generations came to judge a map of such magnitude cumbersome, and not without irreverence, they abandoned it to the rigors of sun and rain. In the western deserts, tattered fragments of the map are still to be found, sheltering an occasional beast or beggar. In the whole nation, no other relic is left of the discipline of geography. So, Bochus is telling us that there was an empire that created a map, and the map became so big that it was at a scale of 1-to-1 with the empire itself. So the map covered the entire empire. And slowly, the people stopped being interested in this, allowed the map to fray. It frayed away and was ruined. Okay, interesting idea. There's a lot of depth in there, but we're bringing this only as a sort of to see how Baudrillard uses this idea. So this notion of a map and territory has been a significant sort of analogy that has been used. And here's the origins of it that I find very interesting. And it says that the map is not the territory. We have to remember that. The world is not the thing it describes. Whenever the map is confused with the territory, a semantic disturbance is set up in the organism. The disturbance continues until the imitation of the map is recognized, the limitation, excuse me. And this is Korzybski, and Korzybski is telling us that the map is not the territory. That every time we recreate a facsimile, an image, an illusion, a representation of something, parts of that are missing. Now, Bochus said the attempt was to recreate it 1-to-1, to create that scale. And when we use AI, we are trying to create 1-to-1 in a sense, or we are not limited by physical space at least. And the question we need to keep in our mind, is the AI identity our identity? Is the world image seen within the model the world itself? Or what is the difference between the map and the territory? And here we'll enter Baudrillard, and let's see sort of his take on this. Baudrillard, well, he's French, so he's smoking a cigarette, of course. Simulacra and simulation. And the distinction between these two notions will come out in this short excerpt. Now, the excerpt starts like this. The simulacrum is never what hides the truth. It is truth that hides the fact that there is none. The simulacrum is true. Ecclesiastes. Now, this is not a real quote from Ecclesiastes. This is fake. It's made up. And this is how Baudrillard opens his book, with a fake quote from the Bible. And why? Think about that. There are no errors here or mistakes. This is intentional. It's not as if he's trying to trick us. We're supposed to know that this is a fake quote. It is a simulacrum. It is a simulation, a truth hiding a truth. And let's see how he expands on that. If we were able to take as the finest allegory of simulation the Bochus tale, where the cartographer of the empire drop a map so detailed that it ends up exactly covering the territory, but where the decline of the empire sees this map become frayed and finally ruined, a few shreds still discernible in the desert. The metaphysical beauty of this ruined abstraction, bearing witness to an imperial pride and rotting like a carcass returning to the substance of the soil. As the map frays and decays, so does the empire. Rather, as an aging double ends up being confused with the real thing. Okay, let's understand what he means. Then this fable has come full circle for us, and now has nothing but the discrete charm of second-order simulacra. There's an empire represented by a map that is being frayed. The map is being frayed, but it is the empire that is also being frayed. Remember, they stopped cherishing geography. They stopped caring for the map itself. The map is dispersed in the desert because the reality doesn't care for it anymore. The representation is ruined as the reality is frayed in itself. Baudrillard continues and says, abstraction today is no longer that of the map, the double, the mirror of the concept. Simulation is no longer that of a territory, a referential being or substance. Simulation is no longer referencing the substance. It is the generation by models of a real without origin or reality, a hyperreal. The simulation of today is no longer a representation of reality as it is. The matrix does not represent the world as it is, right? It gives us a fantasy world, remember. When we escape the matrix, we see the world as it is. For Baudrillard, there is no escape of the matrix. We all live within the hyperreal always. Our reality is a simulation of something without origins. Let's continue. The territory no longer precedes the map, nor survives it. Henceforth, it is the map that precedes the territory. Precession of simulacra. It is the map that engenders the territory, and if we were to revive the fable today, it would be the territory whose shreds are slowly rotting across the map, rather than the other way around. It is the real, and not the map, whose vestiges subsist here and there, in the desert which are no longer those of the empire, but our own, the desert of the real itself. Baudrillard tries to tell us that the postmodernistic world, the world in which we live today, mitigated through technology, created through the end of liberalism in his modernity, right, has transformed the orders of power. We have shifted from a map trying to capture something in reality to reality trying to capture something in the map. The orders have turned such that the map comes first. The simulation precedes reality rather than the other way around. Because there is no more reality that can be taken back or away from the way in which we perceive it anymore. Every version of reality is always simulation for Baudrillard. Now, to try and break this complex idea down, let's take sort of the core essence of this message here and see what I think we find it very powerfully in Hannah Arendt, who's a philosopher that I personally very admire. And Arendt wrote that the trouble with modern theories of behaviorism is not that they are wrong, but that they could become true. Now, if we translate this to AI and to understand the map and territory analogy, we see in Brian Christian's take on Hannah Arendt. And with this, we will end and try to explain everything we just said. We must take great care not to ignore the things that are not easily quantified or do not easily admit themselves into our models. The danger, paraphrasing Hannah Arendt, is not so much that our models are false, but that they might become true. What AI does is has a representation of the world. This representation, according to postmodernistic thinking, is a representation of the map, not of reality. It is a representation of something that does not exist, of an image, a glimpse, a facsimile or a simulacra of the real world, codified and analyzed through data, recreated through narratives, injected with dynamics of power, with interests of companies. And the great danger is that we forget for one instance that the model is not the world, and we allow the world to become the model. Once we allow AI so deeply to be ingrained and accepted within our society, making decisions for us, finding our partners in love, deciding who can live and die, creating our medicines, all the things we've been talking about throughout this whole semester. If we for 1 second mistake those ideas as really capturing what is in the world and not pure simulacra, we will have failed. We will have accepted the map as reality. We will have relinquished our power of critical analysis because the model has become the real. Okay, that was my attempt to analyze sort of Baudrillard and link that back to AI and to our questions of representation. Now, how does that come back to our discussion here about identity, right? Remember, if we're trying to model the identity of Himmler, we talked about that in the beginning, right? Himmler became a pluralist, humanist, a lover of Jews and others, right? That is the map becoming reality, right? We know that's not a proper simulacra or simulation, right? It is neither of those. And the problem is, with trying to capture identity, is that we are only capturing parts of it, and selectively doing so. When we fine-tune a chatbot on my digital footprint, let's say, and we create an Attai version AI bot, is that capturing me? Is that a simulation? Is that linked in any way to the real me? Or is that merely a recreation of a fictitious character, a simulacra, a character that I created on Facebook and Twitter and whatnot? A character that I created by wearing certain clothes, by putting on videos, by talking to specific people. That does not capture our depth of identity and personality. And yet, as we recreate these models, what we are capturing is that superficiality. That Himmler was in the SS, was a Nazi, okay, was, yeah. And remember, I challenged that very briefly, right? He had loved ones, people who saw other sides of him, right? Everyone always says that Hitler was a lover of animals and a vegetarian, okay? People are complex beings. We have a lot of aspects, and to capture our identities, our emotions, our being in a model maybe comes back to what you were saying. Maybe it can't be done. Okay, questions before we move on. Let's try and add a second layer of critique now. We talked about whether we can capture actually something that might not even exist, or something that only exists as a pure representation. Now let's look at the challenges of what does it mean even to be ourselves? What is this idea of personal identity? Okay, and of course, like you mentioned before, here we have a famous picture, and for those who don't recognize this, this is known as the ship of Theseus, or it tries to represent it. And the ship of Theseus is a Greek mythological story. Let's read a short description of it, and we'll see what it says. The ship wherein Theseus and the youths of Athens returned from Crete had 30 oars, and was preserved by the Athenians down even to the time of Demetrius Phalereus. For they took away the old planks as they decayed, putting in new and stronger timber in their places. Insomuch that this ship became a standing example among the philosophers for the logical question of things that grow, one side holding that the ship remained the same, and the other contending that it was not the same. To make that simpler, you have a ship, and over the years, you know, one plank is rotten, so you take it out and replace it. Then the oar is broken, so you replace that. Then the mast needs fixing, so you replace that. And after 30 or 40 years, you point at it and you ask, is this the ship of Theseus? Well, none of its parts are still the original parts. Is it still the same thing? Has it kept its identity? And there's a simpler version of this story that is called The Axe of George Washington, sort of. And the story goes like this. This is my grandfather's axe. My father replaced the head, I replaced the handle, my daughter added some tape to the handle. But this is my grandfather's axe. Is this my grandfather's axe if every single part of it has been changed? Is it still the same thing? Has it kept its identity? Now there's a rich history about thinking about these ideas that goes back to the presocratics, right? Those who predated Socrates. And here's an excerpt from Heraclitus. It's a very famous and well-known one that says that on those who enter the same rivers, ever different waters flow. Right? The expression is later, it was simplified, I think, and said something like, one can never step into the same river twice. It's a famous expression. And the idea, of course, is, well, if the water is flowing all the time, how can this be the same river? Right? Because once I step into it and step out and step back in, it's completely different. Everything has changed. In what sense does it remain the same? Now, we can take this idea to the extreme, and in Aristotle we find this. And this was Critelius, was a student of Heraclitus, and Aristotle talks about him and says, Critelius, who criticized Heraclitus for saying that one cannot enter the same river twice, for he himself, Critelius, held that it cannot be done even once. So what is Critelius pointing out? What is the problem with entering the same river twice? Why does he think it can't even be done once? Well, yes, please. Because the concept, the same river, is an oxymoron, right? You cannot say the same river. It doesn't have sameness. It is not something that has continuous identity. And so if we expand that text a bit, this is the full quote. Let's see some more content on it. And further observing that all this indeterminate substance is in motion, and that no true predication can be made of that which changes, they suppose that it is impossible to make any true statement about that which is in all ways and entirely changeable. Heraclitus became well known as this concept of everything is in flux. And this, apropos Buddhism, comes back to that idea, right? There is no such thing as sameness. Everything is constantly shifting and changing. We continue. For it was from this supposition that there blossomed forth the most extreme view of those which I have mentioned, that of the professed followers of Heraclitus. And as such, Cratylus held, who ended by thinking that one need not say anything and only moved his finger. And who criticized Heraclitus for saying that one cannot enter the same river twice, for he himself held that it cannot be done even once. Cratylus ended by refusing to speak and merely moving his finger, the only way he agreed to communicate. And why? Because nothing intelligible can be said of a constantly changing world. When there is no continuity, none of our words have any meaning. They cannot reference anything at all. So, the finger, that's enough. Now later on, this was adopted by Wittgenstein, and he ends his most famous, well-known book, the Tractatus, saying that whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. Now, Wittgenstein didn't mean that we should just wave the finger, right, and just do nothing else. But Wittgenstein acknowledged this idea that things that are constantly in flux, or in his point of view, things that we cannot express in words, we ought not speak of. Now the question becomes this. What is our continuity? What makes me believe that I am the same person that brushed his teeth this morning, that last week gave a talk on illusions in the matrix, and that last year gave a lecture in Berlin, and that 5 years ago, I don't know, ate breakfast, 3 egg omelets, right? What makes me hold to this idea? In order to get to that point, we're going to shift towards the 20th century. We're leaving behind all our presocratic fellows. We're going to talk about a philosopher that I admire very much called Derek Parfit. Now, Parfit died in 2017, and there's a great biography that was published, I think, last year or a year before on Parfit. I really recommend reading this. It's a wonderful read. It gives you sort of his life and his philosophical ideas. Very nice, written by David Edmonds, another Oxford philosopher, and he does a really good job. But Parfit was well known for his theories on personal identity. And I wanted us to read one of his most well-known sort of stories that he tells us in order to challenge our understanding of what it means for us to maintain personal identity over time, extension over time. So let's see, this is the story of the transplant and Mars. So let's read it together. I enter the teletransporter. I have been to Mars before, but only by the old method, a spaceship journey taking several weeks. This machine will send me at the speed of light. I merely have to press the green button. Like others, I am nervous. Will it work? I remind myself what I have been told to expect. When I press the button, I shall lose consciousness and then wake up at what seems a moment later. In fact, I shall have been unconscious for about an hour. The scanner here on Earth will destroy my brain and body while recording the exact states of all my cells. It will then transmit this information by radio. Traveling at the speed of light, the message will take 3 minutes to reach the replicator on Mars. This will then create out of new matter a brain and body exactly like mine. It will be in this body that I shall wake up. Though I believe that this is what will happen, I still hesitate. But then I remember seeing my wife grin when at breakfast today I revealed my nervousness. As she reminded me, she has been often teletransported, and there's nothing wrong with her. I press the button. As predicted, I lose and seem at once to regain consciousness, but in a different cubicle. Examining my new body, I find no change at all. Even the cut on my upper lip from this morning's shave is still there. Perfect. Several years pass, during which I'm often teletransported. I am now back in the cubicle, ready for another trip to Mars. But this time, when I press the green button, I do not lose consciousness. There is a whirring sound, then silence. I leave the cubicle and say to the attendant, "It's not working. What did I do wrong?" "It's working," he replies, handing me a printed card. This reads, "The new scanner records your blueprint without destroying your brain and body. We hope that you will welcome the opportunities which this technical advancement offers." The attendant tells me that I am one of the first people to use the new scanner. He adds that if I stay for an hour, I can use the intercom to see and talk to myself on Mars. Wait a minute, I reply. If I'm here, I can't also be on Mars. Someone politely coughs, a white-coated man who asks to speak to me in private. We go to his office, where he tells me to sit down and pauses. Then he says, I'm afraid that we're having problems with the new scanner. It records your blueprint just as accurately as you will see when you talk to yourself on Mars, but it seems to be damaging the cardiac system which it scans. Judging from the results so far, though you will be quite healthy on Mars, here on Earth you must expect cardiac failure within the next few days. The attendant later calls me to the intercom. On the screen I see myself just as I do in the mirror every morning. But there are two differences. On the screen I'm not left, right, reversed. And while I stand here speechless, I can see and hear myself in the studio on Mars starting to speak. Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, so what do we see here? Parfit tells us a story. There's a machine that transports us or that destroys our body here and recreates it there. Now, the first version of a machine that we go through for several years seems fine. It seems okay to us. You know, we've done it now once, we've done it twice, we've seen our wife do it, it's all okay. I shouldn't be scared. Then comes a problem. I press the button, and I'm still here, but there's a copy of me in Mars. Now there's a problem. Parfit says, how can there be two of me at the same time? How is this possible? Don't worry, it's a copy of you. Unfortunately, your copy here on Earth will die in a few hours, days, whatever. Now the question I have to all of you. How do you feel at this point knowing that you are about to die in a few days, but nevertheless knowing that a copy of you exists on Mars? Does that console you? Does that make you feel okay with your imminent death? Parfit thinks that until we see a copy of ourselves, we're fine with the situation. But once we are confronted with the duplicate, we cannot accept that that's me. It's not me. It's a copy. I am going to die here. Perhaps I've died every single time and just had all the memories and all the feelings and emotions and personality recreated there. But was that me or not me? Parfit believes that once we notice that the copy of me is there, even if the copy, and he goes on with the story and says the copy tells you, don't worry, I'm going to love our children and wife and I'll continue the work we're doing, and it sort of consoles you that we are one and the same. Parfit believes that this is unacceptable. That this is a tragedy of epic proportions. Once I am forced to see the copy of myself. Okay, now we'll use this sort of story about the transplant and Mars, the transportation, and when we think about personal identity, there's sort of three main aspects that we can provide in order to ask the question, what is it for me to be me, and what allows me to continue over time? Now the first view is called the physiological view, and it sort of maintains that what it means to be me is something that has to do with my physiology, with my body, with my physicality. Right? The cells, the composition of them, the fact that I am in the same body, the fact that I've grown up throughout time. On this conception, according to a biological view, an individual X at time 1 is the same individual as individual Y at T2, just in case Y's biological organism is continuous with X's biological organism. Very simple. Why am I the same person as baby Atai that I see in the picture that my parents sent me? Because it's the same body that has developed over time and there's some kind of continuity that connects us. Now, of course, we know that our cells change over time. We know that we are not sort of complete physical replicas of ourselves over the years. And yet, because this happens slowly, because this is sort of a gradual development, we maintain that connection with our constantly changing self. Remember that everything is in flux, and yet, even though everything is in flux, we persist. Our body changes, our atmosphere and environment change, and yet we persist. according to the physiological view, because there's some kind of bodily connection. Now, an alternative view talks about the psychological connection as opposed to the physiological one. On the psychological view, what makes me me and connects us is that an individual X at time t1 is the same individual as Y at t2, just in case Y sufficiently psychologically continues with X. Thus, on this view, the fact that I have the same let's read here. X and Y must share enough, whatever that amounts to precisely, of the same memories, desires, beliefs, and psychological dispositions. So, if what makes me the same version of me yesterday is because I have the same goals, I still have that same connection to my wife and kids, I still work at the same place, I still have those same aims in life. All these things bring me together. And yet again, there are problems here, right? We know people who go through midlife crises and make drastic changes in their life. We know that we have memory lapses often, that we can't remember exactly why we did something or how we felt at that moment. Does that mean that that's not me? I personally have a horrible memory and I can barely remember anything before the age of 8 or 9. Okay, I have very few childhood memories. Does that mean that the child at I is not me in any meaningful sense because I don't have that psychological connection? What kind of psychological connection can we even have to a child of 3, 4, 5 that are not psychologically developed even quite? Okay, problems here. Finally, the third view tells us that what makes me me and what connects us is this idea of generating a narrative. Okay, we have a narrative that combines us. So what makes an action, experience, or psychological characteristic properly attributable to some person, and thus a proper part of his or her true self, is its correct incorporation into the self-told story of his or her life. The fact that I've created a narrative which explains that I am now devoting my life to academic studies, that I am becoming a parent, that I will, strive the rest of my days to count the number of blades of grass on the ground, whatever. Whatever narrative I tell myself is what creates that identity. And so long as that narrative is coherent, I can pull things into my identity and push things out. Now, this also, of course, creates terrible problems, right? We change our lives often, we change our ideas and desires and motivations, we often make significant shifts, and not all the time can those be together. People who have amnesia, people who pass through trauma or car accidents, we often question, are they the same person? And we say, well, not exactly, but slightly. Yes, it's the same body, but not exactly the same identity. It's very fluid. Now, the overview of this should be understood, actually, that we don't need to commit to any one of these views. I think all these views have problems. And yet, taken together, they offer us a coherent sort of articulation of what it means to have a human identity. It's that we have this combination of features. Now, the right theory, there's a lot of arguments between them, and as I tried to flesh out now, there are weaknesses in each view. But taken together, we can acknowledge that each of these play a certain important role in our continuous extension over time. And when it comes to AI, each one of these has its own problems, as it makes it more possible for us to be copied, in a sense. For if it's only the physiological view, then perhaps a really brilliant, has anyone seen Westworld, for instance? A really brilliant duplication of our bodies will be sufficient to create a duplicate of personal identity. And that's what happens in the show. They create, without spoilers, they create a duplicates of past living people, in a sense. And that raises a lot of questions. Psychological view, what if the AI is fine-tuned again on my memories, my beliefs, my thoughts? What if I upload myself? Have you ever heard of that term, uploading? This has sort of become in vogue recently. Perhaps I can find immortality by uploading my personality. On the psychological view, that would be coherent. And the narrative view also questions what is our role and agency in life. Here's what we got from the personal identity questions, and now we have enough time to talk about the third and final aspect before we come back to asking AI. So let's do this one a bit quicker than normal. And this is about this issue that's known as hard choices and the structure of normativity. Now, before we do that, I brought here another question from the questions you wrote. I don't remember who sent me this. Does anyone recognize this, that it was their question? I would have to check on my laptop. Okay. Do you think that in the future AI could ever think critically like humans? That's the question. So had we created a recreation of ourselves, will those same capabilities still be able to be replicated? And what I want to do is discuss this issue by raising this problem known as hard choices. And then we'll come back to this question and to the general discussion. What is a hard choice? Well, when we talk about making decisions, we often imagine this model in our mind, right? This weighing pattern. And we say, well, we have to make a choice. Let's put all the pros on this side and all the cons on that side, and we'll do a calculation. We'll see which is greater, lesser, or equal than the other. What is more important? What is a better thing to do in that case? Now, what I claim is that when we think about AI, that's exactly what's happening. What we're doing in a more sophisticated way is creating a model, an algorithmic model, that essentially does the exact same thing. Through mathematical calculations in a complex way, it goes from input to output by saying what is greater, lesser, or equal to the other in terms of what should be done next. Okay, now I want to claim that there's something missing in this presentation or this idea when humans make decisions. And that something comes out when we talk about hard choices. So the algorithmic model brings with it something known as the trichotomy thesis. We'll skip this, and let's see what we have. Imagine you're having a basketball pickup game outside here at the university, and this lovely man is standing on the side, and he needs to be chosen for a team. And the other option for you is to go with this lovely person, George R.R. Martin, the famous author. And you have to choose. Who should be on my basketball team? Well, obviously, it's an easy choice. You take LeBron James. But then let's just say you're going that evening to dinner and you want to have a literary discussion. Well, then you would say, well, you know, George R.R. Martin is probably the better choice in that case. And what I want to talk about now is how often in life we come across these types of dichotomous situations which do not always cohere to this idea of better, worse, or equal. And let's look at a few examples. Imagine you have to choose whether you should live in the big city or in the countryside. Well, you have nightlife here you have pastoral environment. Unclear which one is the better choice. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. You just finished a lovely dinner and you have to choose your dessert. Should you go for the Sachertorte or the crème brûlée? Is one of them better or worse than the other? Maybe, maybe not. Finally, let's say you had to choose a career. Should you pursue a career as a philosopher or a career in law? Well, I don't know. They each have other types of qualities. It's unclear that one of these is necessarily better, worse, or equal. And why is it unclear? Because often we have what's known as incommensurability, which means we have factors that cannot be thrown on those scales and measured against each other. They're too different from one another. We cannot exactly articulate whether a great lawyer would be better or worse than a great philosopher in terms of a career choice. And then oftentimes in these cases we have what's known as bidirectionality. Each side of the scale is good for very different types of reasons. Here I would have a wonderful sweet tangy taste, whereas here it would be this bitterness and, right, you get it. Here the nightlife versus the countryside and the cow smell. Here I would have the complex thinking of abstract ideas versus the presentation of being in front of the courtroom. Okay, so let's try and break that down a bit. Job as a philosopher, job as a lawyer. Well, yeah, I always say that this is a very bad example because we know how he came out, right, with the hemlock, yeah. So let's take a different philosopher. This is Hannah Arendt. I mentioned her twice today, wow. Okay, we said that being a philosopher would be, let's say, better in terms of intellectual satisfaction. We're just presupposing that. And being a lawyer would be better in terms of financial security. Okay. Now, the question is, all things considered, is either of them necessarily better or worse than the other? Well, often people have claimed that no, that's not the case. And there's an argument in philosophy known as the small improvement argument. Now here I presented it in a sort of formal version, but I'll go through it on our intuitions. Let's say we cannot decide which job is better, being a philosopher, being a lawyer. And let's say we say, okay, if neither is better, they must be equal. Perhaps, they're just equally as good in this case. Now imagine that instead of Gregory Peck, you could be a more sexy version of a lawyer, right? Now you're Tom Cruise also, okay? Well, who's more sexy? I don't know. I won't get into that. But let's say this is, by definition, an improved version. Okay, it's an X+. By definition, it's better. So let's not argue about that. The question that remains to us is, is the improved lawyer job better than the philosopher job? Well, my claim is that no, that's not necessarily the case. And why? Because the reason we wanted the philosophy job was intellectual satisfaction. And the reason we wanted the lawyering job was financial security. And because those aspects, as we mentioned, are incommensurable or cannot be exactly measured against each other, we might come to the conclusion that X plus is still not better, oh my goodness, than, oh, that's depressing. Okay. All right, so we're back up. Okay, so we said that. That's the small improvement argument. It's meant to show you that when we make small improvements to things, even though the improved version is always better than the first version, it is not necessarily better than the opponent in that case. And this is supposed to reveal to us the intuition that oftentimes the options are not better, worse, or equal than each other. Right? So when we have incommensurability and bidirectionality, what we say about these options is that they are on a par. We say that they're more or less equal in a sense, but not really. And here's why I want to say what's important here. When we have these ideas of hard choices or parity, they're involved with incommensurable goods, goods that are different, and they're good for relevant reasons that are not the same. The options are on a par. And what that creates is a fourth sort of way things can relate. Beyond being better, worse, or equal, things can also be on a par. And what does that mean when we come back to the algorithmic model? Remember, we said that all algorithms function on the basis of this better, worse, or equal, this mathematical variation. What I think is that as humans, we often encounter, in the most important choices in our lives, hard choices that cannot be calculated towards a right answer. There is no right answer in those cases. There's a set of eligible options that are not better, worse, or equal than the other. And so what do we do in that case? Here's the question. Well, the analysis that many of these theorists like Charles Taylor, like Ruth Chang, that they give is that there are two ways of thinking in reality. One way is known as an investigative model, in which we are detectives. We seek out all the information we can. We find out what are all the evidence at play. And then we determine which course of action is better, worse, or equal. And when that fails, when we face a hard choice, we shift to a different mode. And this is called an authorial mode, where we no longer are investigators, but we are authors, right? Like Jane Austen here. We have to write the next chapter in our lives. The facts of reality, the causality that has led us to this moment in time, cannot define or explain for us what is the next step. And why is this important for our discussion? Because if hard choices exist, it means that mathematically we can never resolve a hard choice definitively. That there are choices in the world that can only be solved by making a commitment to be a type of person or another. Our identities and what makes us who we are, remember the narrative model, are those things, okay, never mind, we'll finish without that. Are those things that allow us to claim a certain existence, that allow us to say, this is who I am. No matter what reality has said against me, who I am is a person who chooses to study philosophy rather than being a lawyer, who chooses to become a parent rather than staying a bachelor, who chooses to live in Switzerland rather than, I don't know, somewhere else. These choices are not determined for us. They are not derived from facts of reality. Reality gives us a menu of options. And what it means to be an autonomous agent is having that capability and that normative power to decide what is the right choice for me in this case. This does not entail relativism. It does not entail that everything is right. Not everything is right. There are wrong answers, a lot of them. It does entail that what it means to be a human agent is to have that capability to determine hard choices. Or that's at least our attempt to explain. Now, if we take that and we return to the idea of replicating ourselves, creating a facsimile of myself in AI form, what happens when that facsimile faces a hard choice? what happens when it has to make a decision for me on a case that cannot be determined by my preferences or by my past behavior. It can only be determined by me as an act of authenticity, as an act of being a human agent. And so the claim is that AI is limited by its capability to interact with hard choices. Hard choices sort of pick out that area of life which can be delegated away, but only at the cost of losing our autonomy. Of course I can let the system decide for me. That's easy. I can just randomize. That's not a problem at all. The question is what is lost when I do that? Okay, now, so we talked about a lot of different topics. We talked about personal identity by looking at Parfit's examples and the different models of what it means to be me. We talked about hard choices, trying to give one explanation as to that unique capacity that might be only ours. And we asked about the question of simulacra, whether we can actually replicate something that in reality doesn't even exist, right? Whether we're creating simply a model of a model of a model of a hyper-reality. The issue is that, yes, I have a certain continuation that is coherent and makes sense, right? We usually don't make these leaps where we completely do uncharacteristic things, although that also happens sometimes. We sometimes break our patterns. The point is different. The point is to say that even if it might predict what I would do, it cannot decide what I would do. The making that choice is in and of itself an action of an agent. And what makes me an autonomous agent is the very normative power, that power to decide what is the right thing for me to do at that moment in time. So yes, the system could predict what I might do. It would be wrong some of the times, right? I might try and predict what future me would do, and I would be wrong some of the times. The point that the hard choice is trying to flesh out is that there's a certain sphere of choices in our lives that are uniquely saved for us. It's like a speech act that we have to do. Imagine a promise. When you give a promise to someone, it means nothing unless you gave it. Otherwise, it's just a list of words, right? The power that the promise has is by the fact that you uttered it and meant it. Otherwise, I can't hold you to it, in a sense. It's the same thing. It's this power that we have to grant authenticity and reality to certain things by our speech or by our choices. That's sort of what the hard choices aspect is trying to flesh out, okay? So, no more time for more comments. Thank you very much for the class, and I'll see you all next week.